Hello everyone and welcome to Fiction Friday. Today we have the 38th and final episode of The Squire. I want to thank everyone that commented with their preference for my next audio serial. The voting ended up 6-4 in favor of science fiction. So next time we'll be starting Children of Darkness. I hope you enjoy today's show.
The bulk of the Beastman army has broken through our defensive line and is advancing toward the capital. Rain stared at a general whose name escaped her. Did he want her to do something about it? She wished Cole was here to help her. She knew nothing about war. Of course, he had to go off with his precious Talia to fight the Darkcaster, leaving her alone to deal with this. She took a breath and tried to think what her father would say. How long until they arrive? In a few hours at most. What shall we do, Highness? She wanted to scream that she didn't know what they should do. The only thing that came to mind was running away, but there was nowhere to run to. She'd find nothing but beastmen in every direction. How many soldiers are left in the capital? He shook his head. Not many, Highness. We sent most of them to the borders to stop the monsters from getting this far. We never thought they'd break through. What about the Lightcasters? I could probably scrape together 10, but not our best people. Can they open portals? We can bring back the soldiers from the border and make a new line here. I'll find out, and if it's possible, I'll have them begin at once. The general bowed and hurried out of the war room. If it wasn't possible, they were all going to be dead before the day was out. Truth was, they might be dead even if they brought in reinforcements. Rain left the war room and headed for the raised garden on the second floor. She needed some air and couldn't abide staring at the stupid map any longer. The halls were empty and she walked in silence, which suited her mood just fine. The servants worked in the infirmary, tending wounded brought in from the front lines and preparing bandages for the inevitable new arrivals. Rain had visited earlier, and the stink, combined with screams from the wounded, had overwhelmed her. She'd fled after a few minutes. She shuddered to think what it must be like for the men fighting on the front lines. Somehow, Rain had imagined the battle at the fort had prepared her for war, but that had been little more than a skirmish compared to this. Rain reached the door to the garden without remembering the walk there. She was losing it. She stepped outside and the cold air slapped her in the face, bringing her back to reality. The low, dark sky seemed to press down on her. Rain walked to the edge of the garden and sat on the frozen bench. Far in the distance, a tiny golden disk opened, and tiny figures spilled forth. It seemed the Lightcasters had done it. Perhaps they'd have another day to contemplate their eventual demise. Rain stood, shivering in the late afternoon gloom as hundreds of soldiers poured out of 4 portals and lined up to face the beastmen charging their way. They had courage. She would never deny that. Rain doubted she could stand up and face down death, knowing she had no chance of surviving. She knew she couldn't. If she had somewhere to run, she'd have run. Time passed and still soldiers poured out of the portals. Something crunched behind her, and a moment later a fur-lined cloak was draped over her shoulders. She turned and found King Jared standing behind her. He leaned heavily on a cane, and the claw marks on his face looked red and sore. "Should you be out of bed?" The king tried to smile and managed to wince. "If my people are to die protecting me, it seems the least I can do is bear witness. Isn't that why you're here?" "I just needed to get out of the war room for a while. I'm not certain I'm cut out to be a ruler. I don't think I have the will." "I don't know. Michael says you're doing a fine job. You're still young and you've been thrown into a difficult situation. I doubt I'd have handled it any better when I was your age." Rain sniffed and shook her head. "You're very kind, but all I've done is parrot what Cole told me to say. I never would have managed on my own." "Your young champion is remarkable. I could see why Talia cares for him." Rain stiffened. Did he know about them? Should she say something? He must have noted her reaction. "Don't worry, I bear the young knight no ill will. Talia and I were bound to marry and have a child before my birth. It was never about love, only duty. It's been hard for her living here amongst mortals. If she found someone she can love, I wish her all the happiness in the world." Rain sighed. "You should tell Cole. I think he's afraid you'll find out and order his execution." Jared chuckled. "If I did that, I suspect Talia would blast me to ash. Look." The king's voice had turned grim, and he pointed beyond where the soldiers mustered. Rain shaded her eyes and gasped. The beastmen were in sight, row upon row of them, quick marching toward a force that now looked far too small to stop them. Rain trembled at the sight. She tried to get herself under control and failed. Why do they keep coming? We've killed so many, yet they won't stop. They can't stop, the king said. Beastmen are created beings. The Darkcasters made them in the old times to serve as troops in their armies. Their nature requires them to obey anyone capable of wielding dark power. The creatures are nothing more than pawns without a choice in how they die. It almost sounds like you pity them. I do, to a certain degree, but that won't stop me from doing all I can to defeat them, which isn't much at this point. They've stopped. He was right. The Beastman army had come to a halt some distance from their army, probably to catch their breath considering how far they ran. She somehow doubted they planned to surrender. A figure at the front of the army stepped forward, and darkness seemed to gather around him. The Black Prince, Jared said. It was the first time she'd heard him angry. A light streaked through the sky toward the gathered armies. Rain squinted again, trying to figure out what horror they'd have to deal with now. It almost looked like a person. Talia, Jared whispered. Rain looked closer. No, it's Cole. And he's got wings. Cole tucked his impossible wings and dove toward the ground. For a moment, Rain allowed herself hope. The ground raced to meet Cole at an alarming rate. He felt Talia's amusement, and an instant before they would have splattered, her wings snapped open, beat once, and he landed light as a feather 15 feet in front of the Black Prince. Cole grinned. As entrances went, this one would be hard to top. He drew his sword and leveled it at the Black Prince. Rematch time. Ready to join your master in hell? The black-armored figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound devoid of humor. I humbled you once. What makes you think you'll have better luck this time? Call it intuition. Let's go. Cole leapt forward and Talia beat her wings, powering him into his opponent. Their swords crashed together with enough force to cause a breeze. The Black Prince skidded back a couple feet, but his arm never wavered. The massive sword went back a few inches, then surged forward, lifting Cole off the ground and sending him flying back. He landed in time to see the black sword slash through the air, sending a wave of dark energy rippling toward him. Instinct, or perhaps Talia's mental urging, caused Cole to mirror the movement, and a wave of light energy shot out. The opposing powers came together with a crack like thunder, and jagged shards of power flew in all directions, snarling and popping when they hit the ground. That was impressive, and it seemed now they were even. The question was how Cole would get the edge. Speed seemed to work in the library. Now that he had more room to maneuver, it should work even better. He darted in again, and when the Black Prince swung at him, he spun and avoided the huge sword which sunk a foot into the ground. He completed a full rotation and slashed a great gash in his opponent's breastplate. Blood dripped from Cole's sword. He hadn't missed the flesh underneath this time. That hurt? I bet it's been a while since someone sliced you. The Black Prince growled like one of the beastmen and threw his free hand forward. A pulse of power shot toward Cole. Talia's wings snapped shut around him, and the power flowed over him like water. When her wings opened, his opponent took a step back. He looked afraid. A little, anyway. Snarls and grunts ran through the beastmen, and Cole hoped they'd lost a little faith in their leader. If they hadn't, they would when he laid the bleeding stump of his head at their feet. Cole raced back at him, and their swords clashed again and again. Somehow, the giant blade kept up with Cole's lighter weapon. He clenched his jaw and pushed hard, abandoning all defenses to make one more strike. Sparks flew from the enchanted blades. The black sword creased his cheek when one desperate dodge wasn't quite fast enough. The royal sword bit in return, laying open the Black Prince's arm, shoulder, and abdomen. Bloody and gasping, the two knights faced each other. The royal sword felt like a 20-pound bar of lead in Cole's hand. How the Black Prince raised his huge blade was beyond Cole's comprehension. Cole wrapped both hands around the hilt and charged. This pass would end it one way or the other. He didn't have enough strength for another attempt. He focused on the gap in his opponent's armor that he opened when they fought in the library. The great black sword swooped in toward his head. He ducked and felt it pass within a hair's breadth of his skull. The swing left his opponent wide open. Cole screamed and swung with all his might. The royal sword sheared through armor and flesh, and armor again, cutting the Black Prince in half. Cole staggered and spun around to face the silent beastman. Talia's wings flared, bathing him in brilliant white light. "Run!" As though commanded by a god, the beastmen turned and fled, some trampling their smaller kin in their rush to escape the man that killed their master. Cole stayed on his feet with nothing more than sheer willpower until the last monster fled over the horizon. He fell to his knees, too exhausted to move. "I have to go now," Talia said. "I will miss you, Cole." "No, please don't. I can't lose you too." "I can't stay in this world without a body, and I don't have strength enough to form a new one. Goodbye, my love." Talia's essence flowed out of him, leaving him hollow and bereft. He looked up and saw her ghostly form in the air above him. He reached up and touched her insubstantial fingers an instant before she vanished. When darkness came to claim him, he welcomed it. Cole groaned and opened his eyes. There were more groans all around him and the scent of blood and alcohol. He was either in a tavern in a really bad part of town or the infirmary. He turned his head and found Rain sleeping in a chair beside his cot. When he tried to sit up, he found everything still hurt. Cole grit his teeth and kept going until he reached a sitting position. "Lay down," Rain said. The creaking of the cot must have woken her. "The healer says it's a wonder channeling all that power didn't kill you." Cole sighed. "She wouldn't have let me die." "I'm sorry about Talia. King Jared and I watched your battle from the second-floor garden. After the beastmen fled, the soldiers carried you back to the palace. They all wanted a chance to carry you. I suspect if those men had anything to say about it, they would have you named a saint." Cole laughed and found his chest hurt. "I'm no saint. I only hope Sir Garrus can rest easy now that his murderer is dead. Maybe he's with Talia. If he is, I hope he doesn't tell her any embarrassing stories about me." Rain rested a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sure he wouldn't. Can you help me up? You really should stay in bed." Cole waved her off and swung his feet over the side of the cot. "I need to move around and get some fresh air. Let's go to the garden. Where are my pants?" He found his clothes under the cot and dressed. It was a measure of how out of it he was that he never thought about Rain watching him get dressed until he finished. "Ready?" Rain shook her head and handed him a cane to lean on. "Fine, but if you get tired, we're coming straight back." Cole hobbled through the overfull infirmary. Some of the wounded noticed him and reached out to touch his hand. He tried not to flinch away, but he found the attention uncomfortable. They left the infirmary and made their way through the halls to the garden doors. Servants bustled around. Some offered Rain a quick curtsy. Others stared at him. "Is there anyone who doesn't know what happened?" "The story spread fast. You're going to be famous for a while." Cole grimaced at the idea. Perhaps he could sneak out and hide in the city. They reached the garden door with a minimum of fuss, and Cole pushed it open. The cold slapped him awake, and he welcomed it. Bright noon sun shone down on a thin layer of snow, and he shuffled over to the bench where he first spoke to Talia. He saw her in his mind's eye as clearly as he saw Rain standing beside him. How long would it take him to get over her? He sighed. Probably his whole life. He stood still for a moment and looked out over the peaceful city. They were all still alive thanks to Talia's sacrifice. "It's freezing out here," Rain said. "Let's go back in. I'm not supposed to say anything, but they're planning a feast in your honor." Cole shook his head. "Maybe I can find some beastmen to fight instead." Rain laughed, grabbed his arm, and pulled him back toward the door.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Fiction Friday. If you liked what you heard, you can find more of my fiction on my website, jamesewisher.com. Please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with anyone else you think might enjoy the show. Until next week, goodbye.